is an executive director responsible for the large business unit within the professional indemnity team at Gallagher. He has 25 years in insurance and has been entirely within the professional risk sector, predominantly focusing on placing complex construction-related risks. Paul also advises the RIBA Insurance Agency Board on insurance market development and any technical policy points. That's a great introduction, isn't it, Paul? There's a lot in there.
Sounds a bit more impressive than reality, sadly, but never mind.
Thank you so much for coming today to talk to us. I'll hand over to you, really. And I'd just like to say to all of our guests, Paul is going to not share a presentation. He's here to talk to us about insurance, which I know is a fantastic topic, but really relevant to us as architects and within the sector. But please post any questions that you want within the chat and we'll fire them to Paul as the presentation goes on. So don't feel like you need to wait till the end. But Paul, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to ask any questions throughout. For the next sort of 35 minutes or so, I'm sure the last thing everyone needs is just to hear me talk constantly. So please feel free to interrupt. And I think everyone on this call will probably know that the PI market is in a bit of a terrible state at the moment. It's really, the impact's been felt by architects of all sizes, really probably for the last 3 years or so. But I'll cover off to start with exactly why that is the case. It all started with the Lloyd's of London review. Basically, they looked at, because they lost so much money with some huge catastrophes, they decided to review every single one of their lines of business. And it transpired that PI was the second worst performing class in the whole of Lloyd's, which caused a number of things, but one of which was to ensure that every single syndicate had to review their entire portfolio of business. It transpired that, well, certainly to begin with, that construction PI and the construction related PI was going to be one of the main sort of focuses of that review. At the same time as well, we had Carillion going bust. We had Grenfell at the same time. So it was kind of the perfect storm, which really caused absolute focus on architects and engineers PI. So what did we see? As you will all know, we saw some very significant rate increases, increasing levels of self-insured excess, and a significant narrowing of the policy wording and the policy coverage that was provided to architects. I think the good news is that there is actually light at the end of the tunnel. The market really has stopped deteriorating, thankfully. Firms with a good risk profile, clean claims record, hopefully you won't see much of an increase over the next 12 months, or certainly not too much of an increase, if at all, over the next 12 months going forward. So I think we best perhaps touch on exactly what is a good risk profile. First of all, the obvious one is a nice clean claims record. These are actual payments or reserves which are held by insurers against potential claims which may or may not occur into the future. Insurers aren't too concerned if you have open notifications on your policy, so never ever sort of keep those to yourself, even if a client's been complaining to you or moaning. If it's anything out of the norm, because obviously clients will complain and clients will moan, but if there's anything specific about the quality of the service performed, rightly or wrongly, absolutely let your insurers know. And that should not affect how your renewal progresses. The key thing is to actually tell your insurers about them and as early as possible. If you do have claims, that obviously could cause problems for your renewal. You just have to give chapter and verse. I mean, that's the most important thing. At a really early stage, give chapter and verse about the claim to your broker, who will then hopefully then put some sort of positive spin, if you like, on that notification to your insurer. It is very difficult if you've had significant claims, and when I say significant, it's the definition of significant will obviously change. If you're the biggest architect or engineer in the world, £1 million claim is not going to be the end of the world. But if your current premium is £500, if you have £1 million claim, it's going to be the end of the world in terms of your prospects of getting renewal terms. So it's all relative of what is actually a significant claim. But I think that the most important thing is to be able to demonstrate that you've actually learnt lessons as a result of that claim. Exactly what happened. Do you understand why it actually happened, and really perhaps why your risk management has improved as a result? Whether it's your checking processes, your improved peer review, anything that you could actually try and put a positive spin on to your insurers via your broker, to give the reassurance to an insurer that actually it's happened once, you've learned from it, and it won't happen again. In some ways, and certainly that this would happen in a soft market. So a soft market is when, well, we had one for about 20 years, whereby rates were low, lots of insurers very, very keen to write PI insurance. And it was quite easy, really, because if you had a claim, some insurers actually preferred it, and they would look at you as think, well, okay, they have learned all these lessons. Most firms will have a claim at some point, and therefore I'm quite happy to take these clients on. Unfortunately, that attitude has now changed a lot, whereby people just think, well, they've had a claim, I can't insure them. It's very much computer says no with a lot of these things, unfortunately. I think in terms of the next kind of risk profile factor would be the value of contracts actually being undertaken. This is really, really important. Insurers get scared, rightly or wrongly, by big contract values, particularly if a very small architect is actually undertaking that contract. The key thing here is that try and break the project down. Say, for example, if there are 3 distinct phases or buildings within that development, treat them individually and give those individual contract values. So even if it's a framework agreement that covers a lot, you break those contracts down. You're not talking to your bank manager who's going to finance this overall project. You're talking to a very, very conservative underwriter who, again, will have a computer system that tells him his rating factors, which say that anything more than, say, a 20 million contract value means they have to decline that risk. So again, you have to be extremely cautious and careful, without lying, obviously, exactly what you are telling your insurers about the types of work that you are actually undertaking. And if you're perhaps undertaking a very, very small part of a very large contract, again, this is where it gets quite difficult and quite tricky, whereby the question will be quite generic in the sense that what's the overall total contract value of a project you're working on? 100 million. The fact that your relative part of that is only $1 million, it can be quite difficult to get across. So again, you absolutely have to make it abundantly clear to your broker to get that message across to your insurer that whilst there's a big scary number over there, there's absolutely no link whatsoever to any potential liability or any potential risk that you guys are actually taking on board. So again, it's about communication and it's about being abundantly clear and transparent to your broker, and hopefully your broker understands exactly what you're talking about and can portray that message across correctly to your insurer. And be prepared to provide evidence of your capability and of your track record. Don't take it personally. Insurers have absolutely no idea about how good or bad as an architect you actually are. You're a bit of paper or you're a number on a screen to these guys predominantly, unfortunately, and they will then plug these numbers into a computer, and it comes out with a result. And it's unfortunately, these broad brush rules will just kick out risks regardless, which is nonsense. What you need is a broker who's actually got a good relationship with that insurer, so they can pick the phone up or they can email them and just say, look, guys, Joe Blogg's architect over here, whilst it may say this, actually, these are the type of contracts that they've done for the last 30 years working in a large practice. And in actual fact now, this is absolutely food and drink to these guys. This is a really straightforward risk. So what you need is a broker who actually has a relationship with your insurer, and actually you can just go beyond the number on a screen. That's really important. And I think the next thing in terms of a risk profile that you have to take into account is the types of contracts that you guys are undertaking. So basements, I mean, all these things will be very familiar for you guys.
We've had a question about basements actually.
Oh, okay.
So I'll interject.
Go for it.
It says we find insurers now define basement work as anything with a floor below ground level, even if it's only a few centimetres. This means lots of projects which would never have been considered to be basement projects now fall into that category, which seems nuts and makes things very difficult. Have you got any comments?
Well, if it's just a few centimetres below ground, that shouldn't be considered a basement. What I have found, I've had a load of these conversations with insurers about, okay, this is your definition of a basement. What does that actually mean? And they will shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know. And what we find is that insurers don't wish to kind of put the sort of a line in the sand about these things. They want to leave it open to interpretation at a later date, because if you have a claim that transpires to be a £10 million claim down the line, believe you me, they're going to be quite strict on that interpretation. If in actual fact 3 years before that they said, oh, that's not a basement, that's absolutely fine, that's only 2 centimetres below ground, they won't have a leg to stand on, because they've kind of given that interpretation already. So it's very, very difficult to get insurers to actually nail their colours to the mast about what constitutes a basement or not. But again, lean on your broker to try and get them to some whether they can get persuaded insurer to categorically say, no, this is not, we will not classify this as a basement. And it's a few centimetres, absolutely it shouldn't be classified as a basement. I mean, it's, for me, the definition of basement would be something, an entire room or significant proportion of a room underground. And that's where the issues have come. It's not where the ground level step, it's a step down from ground level. That absolutely should not constitute a basement.
Yeah, if it needs to be tanked, then we're getting into the realms of basements. But insurers don't like basements, full stop. And the very simple reason, because they've had loads and loads of claims. And what you find is a lot of these claims, they are very, very significant claims. And they will often come from very small architects, and they're taking extremely complex, multi-layered basements. And any claims that come in are generally really, really high profile. And we've seen some absolute horrors, and most of these are, I say, really high profile. They make the press, and insurers just don't like anything of that nature. Anything that is high profile, that quite clearly architects take on board, which they don't have the necessary expertise or experience to take on, and it just makes them run a mile. Swimming pools is absolutely another one as well. You have to be prepared to demonstrate your expertise and track record. I mean, we've had claims from swimming pools in basements, and it's just an absolute nightmare. And there was one very, very famous case, I think it was last year or a couple of years ago now, that again made the press about this unbelievable swimming pool basement that just went so badly wrong. But again, all over the press, and obviously we can't, well, it has been in the press, but I won't talk details about it, but it just highlights why insurers are petrified about swimming pools. And I think even if you've got a great track record with these things, I think a key thing is the actual team that's going to be working on this project with you. So again, it's quite helpful to be able to demonstrate the track record of whether it's the contractor, the engineer. And again, it helps further if you've actually worked on a number of these projects together as a team as well. That absolutely you will be able to help sell the risk to insurers. So again, it's what it's all about basically. You've got to sell how good you are and how experienced you are of doing all these different types of projects. Cladding is the next joyful topic in terms of what affects your risk profile. No one wants to touch it. No one can touch it. There will be almost certainly you'll have a blanket exclusion relating to cladding, particularly the combustibility aspect of cladding. Just don't get involved. Just get the client to appoint a specialist direct and just step away, because in terms of liability, even if you appoint a subconsultant, do you want to take the work 100% and you back-to-back contracts and collateral warranties up to the client, all that good stuff.
If they go bust, the client's going to come to you, or if they don't have insurance into the future, their cover may well be aggregated if they do have any cover, and their cover may well be limited if they do have any cover. And if they're not here 2-3 years down the line, the client's going to come after you, unfortunately. So just avoid cladding completely at this moment in time. Things may change going forward. We're hopeful over the next couple of years that the spotlight will move on to something else, away from fire safety and cladding. But at this moment in time, there's a great reluctance to get involved from the insurance market, unfortunately. I think in terms of what is critical, I would say is the timing of any renewal discussion, any renewal negotiation. Just don't leave it to the last minute. No matter how busy you are, start early and absolutely harass your broker. Many of my colleagues will not thank me for saying this, but you've just got to keep on at them. Absolutely, it's so important, because what you often find, if you do start things early, it's quite often the case that the insurer will look at the renewal date and go, oh, I've got weeks for this, I'll put it at the bottom of the pile and deal with things that are coming up for renewal over the next couple of days. That absolutely shouldn't be the case, and your broker's got to be on at them constantly to get some terms for you, because it's quite often a tactic from an insurer. It's an incredibly unprofessional tactic, but they will leave it to the last minute, not to give you any choice. Your broker will have no say in this whatsoever. They could be pushing constantly for terms, and the insurer knows that there's very little competition, and if they leave it to the last minute, you'll have zero time to actually seek alternatives. So it's something that they do routinely, or they're just incredibly busy. Because everything is now done on email, because generally speaking, there's very little broking face to face. It's really easy just to chuck out 20 or 30 markets, 25 of which will decline immediately, or not decline immediately, and then you'll spend the next 6 weeks chasing up these people, then for them to only decline further down the line. Timing is absolutely key, and keeping the press, if you like, on your brokers is really important. And the other thing as well, you'll get asked ridiculous questions. Just don't worry about it. I think you just have to try and respond quickly, and I think don't be afraid to actually ask your broker how you should respond, and guidelines on how best to respond to the questions, because you have to bear in mind, insurers, they're not architects, and they have very little working knowledge of architecture and the architectural profession. So the chances are they're going to be stupid questions. So unfortunately, it's computer says no thing. If the question comes back from them, it's got to be answered. And it'll in the good old soft market days, we could pick the phone up to the insurer and say, don't be so stupid. And these are the reasons why that's a stupid question. We'll say that now, and they'll say, I still need the question answered, I'm afraid. So it's not your broker, it's often not the insurer either. If for whatever reason they have to ask these questions. So just get the questions answered as quickly as possible, so there's not the roadblock in getting those terms back. And ask your broker if they've actually approached other markets. I think that's really key. There are very few insurers who are actually actively writing small architects at this moment in time. Again, go back 5 years, you could comfortably get 15, 20 markets, all of whom were scrambling for business, which is why we saw the premiums reducing over a number of years. They've just disappeared. Lots and lots of reasons, but there are very few people who are willing to write small architects at this moment in time, which really means that the chances are you're not going to be overly happy with the result. But that doesn't necessarily mean your broker's not done a good job. They may well have spoken to 20 markets trying to get you a quote, and there may be just one game in town, unfortunately. What we're seeing now is that most people are being relatively sensible. They've had the increase, they're comfortable in terms of the premium size of their book of business. So hopefully going forward, things are going to be a little bit more civilized. in terms of the in terms of what the premium result will actually look like. There are very few, as I said, markets aggressively looking for new business, unfortunately, because it's the new business and it's that aspect of it which actually drives down the pricing or maintains a lid on pricing. If people know there's no competition, they'll price it accordingly. One of the big things about a hard market is kind of the restrictions in cover that we see, the exclusions that you will see on your policy, which are pretty routine things like cladding, fire safety, combustibility, overseas work as well. A lot of the people that write overseas work, that write small architects can't write anything outside the UK. So just be wary about that, and again highlight that if you've got overseas projects at a really early stage to your broker. If it's mid-term and you've got potential to work overseas, highlight it to your broker at a really early stage. So whilst they may well be able to persuade the insurer to take on board that individual contract, they may well have to start really early to try and get you an alternative market at your next renewal if your main insurer can't write overseas work. The chances are there'll be limitations or maybe exclusions for things like basements and swimming pools, which we've mentioned already. And if those things are proposed, there are alternatives. So most insurers can give cover for basements, can give cover for swimming pools. Ask your broker for options. So whether it's a case of you will have a higher excess for these types of work, you may well be able to get some cover, but it may be narrower cover. So whether it's a case of you could get some limited cover, excluding consequential loss, for example. But the consequential loss aspect of swimming pools and basements are the real thing which scares the insurer. So again, if you can have the cover but exclude it, great, because it's far better. Whether even if you got a smaller aggregate limit, for example, to have some cover than an exclusion. As soon as you've got an exclusion on your policy, insurers won't pick up any costs, and they will say all over to you. So you are then left to defend that claim. It may be entirely spurious. It may just be one of these scattergun approaches from the client where you're dragged in. But it will be very costly to try and defend that away. So make sure you've got some cover where possible, which means your insurers will then pick up the cost, the defence costs of those things.
Paul, I'm going to come to you because we've got lots of questions that are coming in, and I feel like we're not going to get through them all if we don't start on some of them now. I'm going to rattle through some of these because we've got quite a lot that are coming in on cladding, so I thought maybe I'd sort of group those together. In terms of cladding and definitions of cladding, so timber weatherboarding and things like that. Are they all classed as cladding? If we're doing a dormer bungalow and we've got shingles on the outside of it or slates on the outside of it, is it all classed as cladding, or is there different definitions to cladding that you can then push back on your insurer for?
Right, well, so when this thing started after Grenfell, insurers had absolutely no clue what they were talking about, and to be honest with you, most brokers didn't either. And it's been a kind of a learning curve, and it's been evolving over a period of time. But even now, we're seeing some definitions of and some exclusions and limitations that, again, they have no clue. So the default position is if it's, i.e., the outside facade of a building, it's classed as cladding. And then the issue comes around the combustibility, of that cladding. So I've had so many discussions about, well, what about, say, the structural system of how it gets attached to a building? Would that be excluded as well? So there's kind of direct cladding and there's indirect cladding, if you like, in terms of an attachment to a building. So it is an utter nightmare. But the thing is, there are so many different definitions when it comes to the individual exclusions on people's policies. It's impossible for me to answer the question unless you actually see what that definition actually, or what the exclusion actually encompasses. You would hope that the exclusion would be relatively specific in relation to the combustibility of facade material or cladding, and that aspect of it is excluded. The fact that it's it may fall off, or the fact it's not weatherproof, absolutely should not be excluded. Pre-Grenfell, that was covered without any shadow of any doubt. But now insurers will try and drag that in, if you like, within the definition. And it's lazy underwriting, but again, it's not the individual underwriter who's calling the tune here. It's someone at the top of the company who sits there, sees all the problems with cladding in the country, and says, we don't want to touch it, just exclude cladding. Unfortunately, it comes from an uneducated perspective.
And when we've got those things as clauses in insurance, and is it just above those 18 metres? Is it anything? We've seen some real generalised things that are coming through, and it's now being below 18 metres as well. That it's
exactly. It started at 18 metres, so I think that was how high the ladders used to go, or go of the fire brigades. That's how it started, and it's just broadened out and broadened out.
And can people push back on these things? Because obviously some people are going to be doing single story extensions that clients want timber clad and things like that. If your insurance doesn't cover that, I suppose, what are the options? I know that's a difficult one. Sorry, Paul.
Well, there aren't options, unfortunately, at this moment in time. I mean, for me, I would say just appoint a specialist direct. Get the client to appoint someone else to actually undertake that work. Unless otherwise you are going to be uninsured for that work. It's as simple as that, unfortunately. But it's every single architect. There are so very few architects in the country at the moment who have any kind of cladding cover whatsoever. And if you've got some, fantastic, keep hold of it, and don't tell anyone about it, because, well, if you're going around shouting about it, I've got cladding cover, appoint me on your building, guess what? Something goes wrong, you're going to be the only pocket in town, and they're going to come straight after you, regardless of what it is, because the chances are you'll be the only person on the team with any PI cover for cladding whatsoever. So, just keep it, hide it, cherish it, and hopefully you won't have to use it. But if you do have to use it, good luck having it, because it won't last very long.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that, there's a rollout. Most people have hit those big premiums now, which was the stage, and now it's that extent of cover or removal of cover that's coming forward.
And there's very little. You mentioned premiums, and there's very little you can do to actually lower the costs, unfortunately, at this moment in time. Yeah. So there's very little competition, very little viable competition. And I saw one of the things there, was the PI market broken? Yes, absolutely, the PI market is broken. I don't think it's corrupt, so someone asked, but it's definitely broken. And there are elements of some sort of not monopoly, like sort of a bit of a cartel, to be honest with you, for some risks, without question. It's less so now. And in the past, insurers would sit there in the bars around Lloyd's, and they'd talk about risks, even though they're not allowed to do so. And people would talk about it. Now that doesn't happen quite so much. So ironically, that COVID has actually meant that the cartel's been broken a little bit. But it is absolutely, the system is not good at this moment in time. The system worked completely against insurers for 20 years. And this is how they justify it, to say that actually you brokers, you clients have had it great for 20 years, and now it's our turn in the sun, which is wrong, completely and utterly wrong. But unfortunately, what we've seen is that the system, the previous system, was broken as well, because what the premium they took in was not sufficient to pay the claims, and therefore that's why we've seen a huge reduction in capacity. Which is why we've seen all these people withdrawing from the market. I think the only thing you can really do is increase the level of self-insured excess. That's the one thing you can actually do. Take on board more risk yourself. You're really confident with your risk. Being a very conservative insurance broker, I always advise against it, because generally speaking, insurers aren't generous in what they give back to you in terms of premium. But a few £1,000 saving here and there may be really, really important. But for me, I always try and keep excess as low as possible, because that essentially acts as the trigger for the policy. So you have to be very, very careful when increasing excess, and obviously affordability comes into it as well. It's difficult.
Definitely. We've got Leighton Taylor, you've got your hand up. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question to Paul.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, can.
So, great. Sorry, it's Rory from Leighton Taylor, actually. Paul, thanks for your advice so far. Just a quick one on exclusions. Obviously, firstly, it's hard enough finding insurance policies that have the right or don't have exclusions. In particular, for us, we do a lot of basements, so we found it tough over the last 6 months to a year to find the right policy. We found one. It's eye-wateringly expensive, but it's required. So you know, we've proceeded with that. However, my concern is going forward. You know, we're signed up to projects that have you know, 6 or 12 year kind of liability. Yeah. If the market doesn't offer us cover, you know, next year or the year after, am I correct in saying that we as a practice carry that liability?
Correct.
And is there any way to mitigate that risk going forward?
No, so PI is underwritten what's called a claims made basis. So it's the policy in force the time a claim is made as opposed to when the work was undertaken. So this is the nightmare thing about it for people who've undertaken cladding projects, for example, for many years, or swimming pools or basements. And as you said, it could be 12 years, it could be 15 years into the actual long stop. And so it's impossible. You undertake a project, you sign a contract, and you have a PI policy that covers that. Fast forward 5 years, 6 years, the market has changed completely. All these exclusions have come in place. You no longer have the cover for that work, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. If that cover is not available in the market, there's absolutely nothing you can do about it other than talk to your client. Tell your client that you have these exclusions on your policy, the fact that the diligence that you've done and your broker has undertaken, you know, to actually cover off the entire market. There's always a time lag between that conversation and then the client realizing that is actually the current status quo. It's what you find, depending upon when your renewal date is through the year, you know, people's exclusions and restrictions take time to actually catch up. So there'll be some people with lots of cover, but it's because they haven't renewed yet, for example. So it is quite difficult for the client to trust and believe you in that regard. But you've got to have that conversation with the client. You know, if you're able to introduce any limitations into your contract after the fact, great, but it's unlikely. What you've got to have is that relationship with the client that they won't send you bust if something has gone wrong. Because at the end of the day, and the conversation I would be having about in your shoes with the client is that, look, Mr. Client, if you send me down, if I am bust, you lose the PI on every single project I've ever done for you. All the work I've ever done, you will no longer have any PI, essentially. So all of a sudden, it focuses the mind a little bit to say, okay, well, I was thinking about suing you for this 50 grand claim here, but why would I want to do it? Maybe you have to work together to actually resolve the problem. You may have to take some hurt, some pain in relation to, you know, the costs associated with it, but the most important thing for the client's perspective is to resolve the problem and to ensure that actually his or her architect is still in existence going forward.
So on that, just a way of mitigating the risk could be in our appointment document saying we reserve the right to you know, omit elements of PI cover if they're not available to us. Yeah, but, so I mean that basically means that PI, you know, what they want from us, the cover, isn't really worth the paper it's written on, because we may remove it further down the line. No,
potentially. I mean, back in the day when pollution was first limited to an aggregate basis, going back 25 years or so, there were things called evaporation wordings. So it's a full limitation of liability, which basically says, Mr. and Mrs. Client, you can sue me and I will have full liability if I have PI cover. If for whatever reason into the future PI cover is withdrawn for this area, my liability extinguishes with that cover. How successful you would be in actually getting that wording agreed, it's debatable.
Okay. Well, thanks for your feedback.
No problem.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to everybody that's come today. There are lots more questions, some of them just comments and people answering other people's. If there's anything really specific, Paul, if I could send it over to you, if you've got any comments or anything to make, then we can get back to everybody afterwards. Because trying to keep things on time, we've got our next speakers up now. So I just want to say a big thank you to Paul. It was a really detailed conversation, and thank you for taking some difficult questions. It's a difficult market at the moment and things are ever changing. So we really appreciate you coming to talk to us about it today.